Hi, I'm Malika Bilad, filling in for Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, Colombia's potential for peace. After a half-century of civil war, what's most needed for lasting peace? Our digital producer, Omar Badar, is here, and he's looking at a battle of hashtags, dueling hashtags, if we may. What are you seeing?
Ones that are supportive of the potential peace agreement. The hashtag they're using the most often is one that's called Vamos por la Paz, which means let's go for peace. Now, that has been used more than 35,000 times so far. But there are skeptics also about the peace agreement who are using the hashtag Acuerdo de Impunidad, which means agreement of impunity. This is mostly being used by people who are worried that the peace agreement might be happening at the expense of real accountability for the crimes that were committed, and that has been used more than 20,000 times so far. But of course, for this conversation, folks at home, we want to know what you think about prospects for peace in Colombia. Be sure to tweet us using the hashtag AJStream.
Hello, I'm Viktor Livanov. I'm a political blogger from Russia, and I'm in the stream.
Peace talks seem close to ending what is Latin America's longest civil war, the more than 50-year-old conflict between the Colombian government and rebel group Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, better known by its Spanish acronym, FARC. The war started in 1964 after an uprising for greater economic and political rights. In the latest chapter of peace talks held in Havana, both parties have pledged to sign a deal to end the war within 6 months. The most recent achievement was a plan for reaching justice in crimes committed during a conflict that's killed more than 200,000 people and displaced millions. Listen to what Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos had to say about the justice agreement at the UN General Assembly in New York on Tuesday.
Hoy vengo a ratificar ante el mundo que entre los más de 20 conflictos armados que subsisten en el planeta y que generan tanto dolor, tanta pobreza y tanto sufrimiento, hay uno, el de mi país, el de Colombia, que está en el camino final de una solución real.
So what's needed in a genuine solution for peace? Well, with us to discuss this via Skype in Bogota, Colombia, Eduardo Alvarez of the Ideas for Peace Foundation. He's a coordinator of the Dynamics of Conflict and Peace Negotiations program. Also in Bogota, Andres Fernandez, an advisor in the Colombian Agency for Reintegration. That's a government agency dealing with former fighters. In New York, Federico Hoyos, a congressman in the Colombian House of Representatives. He's a member of the Democratic Center Party and opposes the ongoing peace dialogue with FARC. And in South Bend, Indiana, in the United States, Douglas Castle, a law professor at Notre Dame University and advisor to the Colombian government in the Havana peace talks. Welcome to all of our guests. Now, Andreas, I'd like to start with you. It's been more than a half-century of war in Colombia, as we mentioned. What impact has that had on you personally?
Well, personally, I think I share the same results that most Colombians have had, either a friend or a relative affected directly or indirectly by the conflict, experiencing death or very, very difficult situations. And that's part of the problem, the individual suffering that all of Colombians have suffered. But the other problem is also how the conflict has affected our path to sustainable development. The conflict has made all of the Colombian society to focus and experience of all these terrible situations. And in that sense, as a society, we haven't been able to focus in the important issues, or in the most important issues like education, health, infrastructure, poverty reduction, equality. So in that sense, putting an end to the conflict will focus all of Colombian society back to the priorities and without the deaths and suffering that we have experienced in the last 50 years. So I think definitely it's a major break point for Colombian history, right, to be able to get a peace process.
Well, you mentioned the death and suffering, and Eduardo, I saw you nodding your head there to what Andres was saying, but for an international audience who may not be as aware to what it is like or what it has been like to live through that in Colombia, give us more details.
Well, I'm a young person, I'm a young guy, I'm 35 years old, and I can't recall a single day without an event of violence in my life here in Colombia. As a matter of fact, when I was 13 maybe years old, I saw myself a bomb exploding in Bogota from the top of the mountains where I was studying my high school. This was a bomb that was exploded by the cartel de Medellin, by the Medellin cartel. And of course, that affects you. You might not be very close to violence as victims per se, because I can't claim myself to be a victim. But as Andres was saying, we all do have relatives, close friends, acquaintances, and so on and so forth that have suffered violence in a certain degree. I myself have some of my friends whose fathers were kidnapped. I'm close to some journalists who have been sexually abused by paramilitary squads. So I cannot say that I've seen more violence committed by guerrilla groups or by paramilitary groups. I think I've seen violence committed by all sides. Mm-hmm. And I experienced this even closer when I was in the military, as a year of compulsory military service. I'm not going to say I went to war, that I went to battlefields and so on, no, because I went to high school, so it's a different compulsory service that we have to do here in Colombia. But I saw like mutilated soldiers, blind, without arms, and so on, and that kind of affected me, and that really took me to a different path in my life. I was going to be an engineer. I decided to study journalism and political science, so it kind of affected me, of course.
So, Malika, these things that he's describing are part of why so many people just feel a little disheartened. We're hearing here from Eddie, who tweets in saying, feels like we've been down this road too often, makes it difficult to garner optimism, hard to blame those who aren't optimistic given everything that's happening. But we have Mariela over here who also says the government needs to address paramilitary groups still operating. Many human rights, opposition, and union activists have been killed recently. Federico, what is the situation like right now? I mean, I know we're technically in a ceasefire, but are there still incidents of sporadic violence happening?
Well, once again, thank you for having me. And I totally agree with Andres and with Eduardo that we all want a peace agreement and we want peace in Colombia. And of course, all of us have suffered in a way or another violence. I, as a Colombian, have suffered directly the violence in my country. And as my colleagues here, I have also an acquaintance, a friend, a relative who has been kidnapped, killed, or any sort of crime. Our main issue and our main point as an opposition party, not to the peace process, but as some of the points who have been dealing with the FARC in Cuba, is that the way we believe the peace is being negotiated right now is not going to be sustainable in time. Since we believe there's a big amount of impunity in the agreement so far, and if a peace agreement does not have effective jail, if a peace agreement does not punish the criminals who have committed it during decades in Colombia in a strong manner, if narco-traffic, if crimes against humanity does not have the punishment strong enough, the violence is going to be over and over in Colombia for decades to come. So, of course, we want a peace agreement, and there are parts that we value, and I believe, as Andres was saying, that the effort has been important. Nonetheless, there are many parts that worries us as a party, as Colombians, and of course, we want a peace, but we want a peace to be sustainable and to be real for Colombians.
Okay.
Not just a peace agreement that's not going to be sustainable.
You mentioned several things there: impunity, not effective jail times. I want to go to Doug, because Doug, you were in the room when these negotiation talks were being negotiated. What's in this deal?
Well, the first point is, in order to have a sustainable peace, you need to have a peace. The fact of the matter is that the FARC comandantes, unsurprisingly, were unwilling to sign a peace deal which would have sent them straight to prison. So I certainly appreciate and respect the congressman's desire to have prison time for some of the FARC comandantes and others who've committed serious crimes. But to expect that to be done completely in a situation where their consent is necessary to a peace agreement is not realistic. What the agreement does provide is not impunity, but rather a combination of truth, acknowledgement, reparations, justice, and non-repetition for the victims of serious crimes in Colombia. There will be no amnesty, none, for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and serious violations of human rights. For those members of the FARC who refuse to fully disclose the truth to the tribunal and fully accept responsibility for what they have done, they will be put on trial and will face prison sentences of 20 years. On the other hand, those who do fully disclose the truth and accept responsibility for what they've done will face two kinds of sentences that will run in parallel. One is that they will do 5 to 8 years of work in reparations for the victims, which of course is a good thing. And secondly, they will be subject during those 5 to 8 years to what are called effective restrictions on their liberty, which will be ordered by the tribunal. So is this prison time for the FARC comandantes if they tell the truth and accept responsibility? No. But is it impunity? No. Is it the best agreement that could be achieved at this time? I think so.
Federico, you don't look convinced.
Well, first of all, I would like to greet Professor Casella in the beautiful campus at Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana, an amazing place. Professor Casella, my main questions are, the millions of dollars that have been gained by FARC over decades of conflict, of narco-trafficking, of extortion, of kidnapping, it's not clear that the money that they have gained, the thousands of millions of dollars, are going to go into reparation for the victims. Secondly, of course, truth is a vital part in the agreement. Nonetheless, the FARC commandantes so far have not acknowledged any kind of responsibility. 2 days ago, the FARC's maximum leader said he didn't regret anything he had done in his life. So of course, you and I are in the same place as we want peace and we want a sustainable peace. Nonetheless, if there is not a recognition, an effective recognition of the crimes that have been committed, and if there is not a sense of sadness in those who have committed these crimes, there's not going to be a sustainable peace, and that is our main concern, as well as the reparation of victims, as you were mentioning.
So we have people online who are having this debate as well, who are weighing in on it. We have Niaba over here who says that a core stumbling block will be the distinction between political crimes and war crimes in terms of amnesties and accountability. And then we have Mariana here who says truth-telling, reparations for victims and families, and justice for the most important crimes. Amnesty is not accepted for core crimes. Andres, in your view, what sort of crimes would, in your mind, warrant amnesty for the sake of achieving peace?
Sorry? I couldn't hear you well.
Yeah, what kind of crimes do you think would warrant amnesty? In what cases do you think forgiveness is a good way to go about things for the sake of achieving a peaceful solution?
Well, we had a good experience in the agency with the former paramilitary groups. Our agency currently has received 48,000 people. Approximately 30,000 of them were from former paramilitary groups, 50,000 from FARC, and 3,000 from ELN. And if we go back to the results of what happened after those demobilizations, a great portion of those members of the paramilitary groups had a form of amnesty, and fortunately, the great majority of them have returned to society and respected all the legal frameworks. 76% of our participants after the process all respect the legal frameworks and don't return to illegal activities. So I think we have to see the picture in the long term, and having reconciliation and ending the cycles of violence as our objective. As President Santos says, we have to balance justice and peace. But I think with this agreement, we are finding an adequate balance, and I think it's worth it in order to have a Colombia which can live with peace and with a sustainable peace and reconciliation in the long term.
Right. Of course, not everyone agrees with that. I see you, Eduardo, dying to get at it. I want to show you something, though. This is a poll, before I go to you, this is a poll done by Gallup. This is August 2015. 54% of people do support the peace negotiation, but 40% support military action. So, Eduardo, you're listening to this conversation. You see what other Colombians think. What do you have to say?
Well, I think that the opinion, of course, have changed a lot since the peace talks. started. But first of all, I was going to jump in a different way, because I agree to a certain extent with all of you, especially with the congressman. I think that it is not about forgiveness. Forgiveness is an individual dimension of reconciliation, and we cannot ask all Colombians to forgive each other. That's an individual dimension. That's an individual process that can take up to decades or maybe never. But what I want to raise an aspect here, and I want to make a remark, is about the politics of recognition. What the congressman just raised is very important. The fact that Timoshenko said that he was not going to take into account or recognize what he has done, that's not a good sign. Although that's, and pardon my expression, normal in this kind of situations. We saw the same thing with the paramilitaries. The beginning, 2003, 2004, and 5, they were not at all recognizing what they have done, and they've been doing for the last 10 years. Politics of recognition is a very important variable here, because if you recognize, you can share common grounds to understand what happened to the other and maybe imagine a shared future.
So Federico's raising his hand as you say that, Eduardo. I want to explain for our international audience, when Federico mentioned the leader of FARC and then you mentioned the name Timoshenko, that is the same person. I actually want to show you something that FARC tweeted in English. This is that FARC leader, Timoshenko, arriving at the airport in Havana. This is September 23rd. Yeah. Peace is coming is what this picture says. So he believes it. Here's another tweet. This is from the president. This is President Santos, who says, "We haven't finished the last points, but the conclusion is only this: peace is possible. It's closer than ever." Not everyone is convinced, Federico, and I think you would be in this camp, because this is former President Uribe saying, Santos, it's not peace that's near, it's the surrender to FARC and the tyranny of Venezuela.
I would have two concrete ideas. First of all, greet Eduardo in Bogota and tell him one thing: the fact that the paramilitary peace agreement or settlement had it was not well and it had some flaws. It doesn't mean that in any way these sort of flaws of the past are going to be repeated in the present and in the future. Of course, what happened in the past, there may have been good things, bad things, but it doesn't mean that in the future they need to be repeated again. That would be a first thing. And secondly, when you pointed out the Gallup poll, there's a very important part we need to discuss in this conversation, is that 80% of Colombians, 80% according to the polls you were mentioning, do not want any political participation of the FARC leaders. It's a very important thing to be said, because of course the people want to, a settlement to be a negotiated peace, and I think that's good. But the thing is, a negotiation with very specific terms, one of them being not political participation for those who have committed crimes against humanity.
Mm.
Yes, of
I think
course.
It's important
but
to go back to what Eduardo said about recognition. I agree with him completely that you cannot mandate forgiveness. You also cannot mandate repentance or regret on the part of someone like Timoshenko. But what you can mandate, and what the agreement that we have negotiated mandates, is that they tell the truth and that they accept responsibility for what they've done. In other words, they say, yes, I did it. That's as far as you can go in requiring people to take responsibility. And those two steps, studies around the world and my own personal experience in many countries shows, are very important to victims.
And what happens if they don't tell the truth? What happens if they don't?
If they don't, they face 20 years in prison.
And one thing, Professor Casal, I would like to ask you this respectfully: who's gonna be the judge, or the let's say the organization who's gonna make sure that the truth is being said, and the truth is the real thing, and not just to hide the things they have done in the past, and to say, no, right. I have not kidnapped, I have not kidnapped, I have taken hostages, as the way they said. Right. So I'm wondering who's going to be that judge, who's going to be in charge of making sure that the truth is telling to the Colombian people and also to the international community as well.
That's right. And the answer is the judges will be the judges of the Tribunal for Peace. When they receive these declarations of so-called truth by the FARC, they are not just going to take the FARC's word with it. They will already have received a detailed report from the Prosecutor General of the nation, who, as you know, has been investigating the FARC literally for decades and has, in the case of one of the lead FARC commanders, as many as 40 convictions, criminal convictions against Ivan Marquez already. They will also have received reports from all the other agencies of the Colombian state, as well as reports from groups of victims and groups of organizations of human rights. So all of this information will be before the court when it receives the declaration of truth from the FARC, and the court will be in a position to see whether the FARC has omitted anything.
Right.
Well,
And any FARC member who fails to tell the full truth in the light of all this information will be sent for trial and face 20 years in prison.
But there's another concern here beyond accountability. There are some people in our online community who are raising this. We have Mejia over here who says this peace negotiations are making progress, but they might be too idealistic. She says, I'm dubious with how plausible reintegration is and how well the government will concede to FARC's demands. Andres, for people who have spent their entire lives basically operating with these either paramilitary forces or FARC, and they're making a lot of money off of drugs, how easy is it for them to actually transition to becoming regular productive members of society?
Well, we've been doing it for 12 years already, with very successful results. We have 12 years of learned lessons, working in the territories with 34 offices, building on the positive things that every predecessor of the Colombian Reintegration Agency has done. That's very important. And we have managed to construct a reintegration route in which former members of illegal armed groups receive the personal attention in different areas. In the main areas they require to do the transit to society, to legal activities. And the results, as I've said, are very positive. 76% of participants in our program never go back to any form of illegal activity. If you compare that to an alternative, which could be jail, you have the opposite figures. In jail, once someone goes to jail, only 30% maintain legality once they're out, and 70% normally reincide in illegal activities. So the message is we are prepared to receive the members of FARC and eventually ELN. We have already received 48,000 people. We have the experience. So that's why I'm so confident and so positive that this is possible.
So, Andreas, that's an interesting point. But in addition to this, is another prong of this peace agreement is reparations for victims. This is another tweet from former President Uribe, who says, what reparation is it to victims if there's no punishment for their tormentors and the tormentors don't repent? Eduardo, is reparations as they are now, are they sufficient?
There are a lot of forms of reparation. One of those reparation is truth-telling, politics of recognition, administrative, putting down money for reparation. What is really worrisome is, I think there is a lot of mistakes and a lot of narratives right now that are going on in the country that are not helping. First of all, we don't know the agreement, and that's an error of a strategy. That's a mistake. Because it basically denotes that there is not a strategy of communication within the government, the FARC rebels. We don't know what is going on. Second of all, it is true that truth-telling is important, but we cannot reduce, for example, reparation to see all the rebels, the ex-guerrilla members in jail. International law has advanced a lot in order to say, jail is not the only way that these people is going to pay for the wrongdoings. What other experiences in the world have shown is that sometimes reparation take place into the local level. We have experiences
Eduardo,
in Africa
I'm going to pause you there. It's an interesting point, and I actually want to talk about that more in our post show. That's all the time we have in the main show. So we're just pausing the conversation. There is more to talk about at stream.aljazeera.com. And you watching at home, you can help us keep this conversation going using hashtag AJStream. We'll see you there. Welcome back. This is the Stream's online post show. We're talking about a possible end to the Colombian Civil War and what's needed for peace. We're going to get right back to that conversation. I had to pause Eduardo just as we entered into the post show. So Eduardo's going to pick it right back up where he left off.
Yeah, sure. I mean, what I was telling is that international law has advanced a lot, and Professor Casal is an expert on this matter. To say that if we want a transition from a condition of war to a condition of peace, we have to create exceptional and transitional institutions so we can really turn the page. Yes, I know people, and that's a thing that we have to understand. There are people here in our country that would love to see paramilitaries, rebels, military, and so on rotten in jails, but that's not an achievable and a realistic goal if we really want to turn the page. And I think this agreement is of what we know, because I don't know the agreement. I haven't read it. I just know the basic stuff. But what we know about this agreement is that they are trying, first of all, to acknowledge the historical roots of the conflict. It's trying to really turn the page, so there is not a perfect process of reintegration, but they are taking into account the political reintegration of FARC members, which is important. But we cannot speculate. I mean, we can't say Timoshenko is going to be the next president of Colombia, because something that is true is that FARC is not a popular
That's a huge
movement.
speculation. Are people actually saying that, believing that?
Well, people have been saying that, and I'm not sure if ex-President Álvaro Uribe said that, but in some circles, in some sectors of society in Colombia, people really think that. I mean, I have uncles, familiars and so on. They say, we deliver the country to the FARC members, and that's not true, because the same narrative took place in 2005. In the time of paramilitary demobilizations. Oh, they're legalized, that's why they have to demobilize, and so on and so forth. But they never wanted to understand what the paramilitary project is about.
Eduardo, I want to pause you because I want to give Federico a chance to respond. He was raising his hand when you were talking. I know he's thinking things, and I also saw Doug looking like he wanted to respond. So Federico, go ahead.
Thank you. I would say to Eduardo a couple of things. The first of all is I don't believe it is unrealistic to ask for effective jail from 5 to 8 years for the FARC commanders. I don't think that's an unrealistic and let's say a dream thing. No, I think that's realistic. And of course, myself, I would love to see these guys 30 or 40 years into jail. But of course, I'm realistic and I know that's not possible to do. But a 5 to 8 years effective jail sentence is a realistic thing. It happened with the paramilitary process, which I know it's not perfect. And many of these guys who went into jail, the paramilitary commanders, are getting out from jail right now. I think that's not good either. Nonetheless, it was a realistic thing that Colombia saw as an effective punishment. And the second thing would be to say that there's not clear data on how rich the FARC are. Nonetheless, the Forbes magazine released a couple of months ago an article, and they said that the FARC was the third most rich terrorist group in the world, right after Hamas and Al-Qaeda. They spoke about $600 million of gainings each year. I'm wondering, as a Colombian, as a lawmaker, where are these $600 million a year going to be destined in the reparation of victims? Of course, I agree with Professor Casal, and truth is a very important part of a process, and people do want truth. Nonetheless, I think truth is insufficient. There needs to be truth, but also effective reparation with money for those who have been taken out of everything, their lands, their properties, even their family members.
Right. So Federico, let's knock that over to Doug then. Are these things that are being discussed?
Absolutely.
Well, I would like to know that from Professor Casal.
What the agreement provides is that each of those who confess the truth and accept responsibility will be required to provide 5 to 8 years of labor on reparations. How that will work is that the FARC will have to propose a plan of what reparations they propose to do in a given community. They will then have to take that plan to the victims in the community to consult with the victims, to receive the opinions of the victims about the proposed reparations. And also to ensure that the victims are supportive and not opposed to the reparations. The victims then have the right to go before the Special Tribunal for Peace and make their views known to the tribunal. Only after all of that will the tribunal order reparations. And in doing so, it can either accept the plan proposed by the FARC or reject it or modify it. In terms of the supposed wealth of the FARC, that is something which is not an issue in the justice agreement per se. That is something which the negotiators in what is called the Mesa, the main negotiating table, have been discussing and will be the subject of discussions for the next several months. But it's clear that the government will leave no stone unturned in attempting to find all of the wealth that the FARC may have.
So just to switch gears here a little bit, we have something that's interesting that is coming up from community. We have Catalina over here who says, I live abroad but support the agreement because after 60 years of war, a peace process is our only exit from this conflict. And she goes on to say, among the list of things that she would like to see is truth about records, numbers, places, names. Learn it and make it part of our history and pass it to future generations. Eduardo, given the polarization that we're seeing in Colombian society, what are the odds of there being one narrative that could be passed down that everybody can agree on, that could be part of textbooks moving forward?
Well, that's what we all think about, but I'm very skeptical about one narrative. First of all, truth by definition is partial, and truth by definition is also a battlefield. What really worries me about is that we still don't have a narrative, a definite narrative of the history and roots of the armed conflict. There have been some efforts, of course, and very important efforts here in Colombia, but thinking that a definite narrative that's not going to happen, and that wouldn't be a good thing at all. At the same time, what really worries me is that we haven't finished the process with the paramilitaries, and there is not a single narrative there with the paramilitaries. And now we're going to enter into a new cycle of transitional justice regarding this process with the FARC. And then we might see another cycle of transitional justice with the ELN rebel group. So to think about right now of a single narrative, it's impossible. I mean, look at Germany, 70 years later, and they still don't have a narrative.
Andres, I want to bring you in here, but with this is from Human Rights Watch, who released September 28th, this saying Colombia is dealing away justice. And basically it's criticism that this peace plan is too lenient to FARC, and criminals who confess their crimes will see no prison time. So more criticism here of this. What would you like to see happen moving forward? We know we have about 6 months before we see a peace agreement. What would you like to see happen in that time?
Well, that was more a question for Doc, but what I can say is that there is a narrative that we can all use, and is that Colombia has to forget about using violence to solve conflicts. That's the narrative as Colombia as a society we need to address and agree to, that we can have differences, we can think differently, we can have different political views. But violence shouldn't be the way to solve conflicts, and I think that's one of the most important results these peace agreements will give, and that is what we have to give to our future generations in order to have a sustainable peace for the future, and focus in other important things that need to be addressed in Colombia, like development in the territories. Improving social public services to most vulnerable sectors of society. So there is a narrative. The narrative is that Colombians never used violence as a form or as a way to solve conflicts. We can use democracy, we can use ideas, and we can use arguments. But there is a narrative in which all we can agree to.
Okay, so forget about using violence to end conflicts. And because you so beautifully mentioned Doug there, passing the buck to him, I want to give all of our guests a chance to answer that question on what you would like to see happen coming forward in the next 6 months or so. Doug.
Well, first of all, realism. The congressman suggested that 5 to 8 years in prison for the FARC could be realistic because it was for the paramilitaries. And my good friends at Human Rights Watch have argued also for prison. I should point out that a number of other major international human rights groups, including the International Center for Transitional Justice, which specializes in these kinds of issues, and the Washington Office on Latin America, which specializes, of course, in Latin America, are supporters of this agreement. And one of the reasons that they support this agreement, and that I support this agreement, is that there is not another party at the table who is willing to go to prison if they tell the truth and accept responsibility. The government may want that. The congressman may want that. Human Rights Watch may want that, but it takes two parties to reach an agreement. And there's no party on the other side of the table prepared to enter into that agreement. And without an agreement, Colombia continues to suffer from who knows how many more years and decades of a bloody war.
And Eduardo's nodding his head there, so we'll go to you next on what you want to see happen.
Well, I would like to see a doses of realism. First of all, let's find a shared language about what is going on really here. And I think what is going on here is not exactly a peace negotiation. It's a political negotiation with an insurgent group. It's only one group, which in theory is going to disarm and demobilize or put aside their weapons and so on and so forth. But peace, it's a very long process. It'll take decades to achieve. We have a lot of threats and risks going on in our country that will affect the future of the rural and urban security in some territories in which the state has never been and other forms of state have been built and consolidated. So I would like just to, yes, of course, put this agreement to an end, see the final signature with between the government and the FARC commanders. That'll be like really important point, a breakthrough in our country, but also a doses of realism because the risks and the challenges we have in the near future are really, really important to take into account.
Federico?
Well, let me agree with those who have said realism. I would also like realism. And let me define what realism should be. Eduardo just mentioned that one of the points or the agreements in the justice agreement was for the FARC to put aside the weapons. Put aside, not to give them into the state control. So that's a big worry, that the FARC are going to put aside their weapons, but they're not going to hand them in effectively into the state's control. And I believe that if a peace process wants to be sustainable and if we want to reach a real peace, first of all, weapons, illegal weapons, should be in power of the state and not of an armed group, an illegal armed group that's going to put them aside. Secondly, reparation.
I think, by the way, the government would completely agree with you on that. That's what they're negotiating now.
Well, yes, sir. I would also like to see that, but the agreement that was just released, or at least the press release, because the agreement is not published yet, speaks about this, about putting aside the weapons, not handing them in effectively into the state, and of course that's a worry for most of us. And also, I would say that the tribunal, Professor Casel was mentioning, it's very worrisome because the agreement, or at least the press release, states that the tribunal is going to be integrated by justices picked by the FARC and picked by the government. Of course, I do trust that the government is going to have a good criteria on this. But what guarantee are we going to have that the FARC are going to pick justices that are not going to benefit their interests? Never in history. Sorry, sir. Go ahead.
So, I'm gonna step in here just because we are running out of time, and I know that the two of you could go back and forth on this for a very long time. But you heard there Federico's concerns moving forward. You heard the rest of our guests' viewpoints for what they want to see moving forward and the issues that still need to be addressed. Of course, that conversation can continue online. It can continue on Twitter with #AJStream. And it's funny, there's actually someone on Twitter that wants to tell one of our guests to get on Twitter, get a Twitter account. All of our guests, most of you have one, but Professor, I'm looking at you. I want to move our conversation, give the last word to Omar and our community. And what are they saying?
We have a final word here from Eileen, who's tuned into the conversation and said, it's a really interesting debate. As a Colombian, I prefer an imperfect peace over a perfect war.
Beautifully said. Thank you to all of our guests, Eduardo Alvarez, Andreas Fernandez, Federico Oyas, and Douglas Castle. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.